The moment Fannie Dugan stepped off the stagecoach in Caldwell, Kansas, in the spring of 1879, a gunshot cracked through the dry afternoon air and sent every soul on the main street diving for cover, every soul except one. Wesley Keller did not flinch. He was leaning against the post of the livery stable with his arms crossed over his chest, a weathered brown hat pulled low over dark eyes, and he watched the direction the shot had come from with the calm, calculating stillness of a man who had learned long ago that panic never helped anyone. He was 27 years old, tall and lean in the way that hard work makes a man, with a jaw that looked like it had been carved from the same red sandstone that rimmed the Chicaskia River Valley. His reputation in Caldwell was simple and unambiguous. He was the best horse trainer in southern Kansas. He settled his debts on time, and he did not start trouble. He finished it when it came to him, but he did not start it. The gunshot turned out to be nothing more than a drunk cowhand celebrating payday a little too enthusiastically outside of the Red Horse Saloon, and the moment the street understood that, folks began standing upright again, brushing dust from their clothes and muttering with the particular embarrassment of people who had just shown fear in public. Fannie Dugan, however, had not ducked. She had not ducked because she had been so thoroughly disoriented by the sight of Caldwell itself that her body had simply failed to register the danger in time. She had been standing on the top step of the stagecoach platform, one hand gripping her travel bag, the other shielding her eyes from the blinding Kansas sun, and she had been staring at this town with an expression that Wesley would later describe privately to himself, lying awake in the dark of his bunkhouse, as the most honest expression he had ever seen on a human face. It was not fear exactly. It was not disappointment. It was the face of a woman reckoning. She was 23 years old, originally from a small town outside of Cincinnati, Ohio, though she had spent the last year and a half in Wichita working as a seamstress and a teacher's aide at a boarding school. She had brown hair that the Kansas wind had already decided it owned, dark hazel eyes that caught the afternoon light with something like fire in them, and a posture that suggested she had been told her whole life to stand straight and had eventually decided to do so on her own terms rather than anyone else's. She wore a practical gray traveling dress that was dusty from the road and a pair of boots that were clearly more suited to Cincinnati sidewalks than Kansas dirt roads, and she carried a letter in the breast pocket of her jacket that had brought her here. The letter was from a man named Gerald Hooper, a cattle rancher who had placed an advertisement in a Cincinnati newspaper some 3 months prior, seeking a wife of good character and practical disposition. Fannie had answered that advertisement for reasons that were complicated and private, and that she had spent 3 months on the road working up the courage to explain to herself honestly. She was not desperate. She was not naive. She was a woman who had looked at the narrowing road her life was traveling and had decided, with the same clear-eyed practicality that had carried her through 23 years of being told what she could and could not do, to make a sharp turn. What she had not anticipated was arriving to find that Gerald Hooper had died of a fever 2 weeks prior. She learned this from the postmaster, a small, round-faced man named Elias Prout, who handed her the news with genuine sympathy and a glass of water, explaining that Mr. Hooper's foreman had sent word to Wichita, but that the letter had apparently missed her on the road. She sat in the wooden chair beside Elias Prout's counter for a long moment, holding the glass of water in both hands, and she did not cry. She thought about crying. She considered it carefully. Then she set the glass down, thanked Elias Prout for his kindness, picked up her bag, and walked back out into the Kansas afternoon. She had $11.40, no connections in Caldwell and no plan. She stood on the wooden boardwalk in front of the post office and looked up and down the main street of this town that was, in 1879, one of the roughest cattle shipping points in the whole state of Kansas. The Kishom Trail still poured longhorn cattle and Texas cowboys through Caldwell streets in the spring and summer, and the town had a hardness to it that came from the friction between the men who trailed the cattle north and the settlers who were trying to build something permanent in the same ground. There were saloons and a church within 50 yards of each other, a general store and a gunsmith, a hotel that looked like it was losing a slow argument with gravity, and everywhere the smell of horses and cattle and wood smoke, and the particular sweetness of the Kansas prairie grass that rolled away in every direction beyond the edge of town. Wesley Keller had been watching her since she stepped off the stagecoach, though he would have strongly denied that if anyone had asked him. He watched her come out of the post office with her bag and her $11.40 and her expression of absolute composure, and he watched her look up and down the street with those hazel eyes that seemed to be doing complicated arithmetic about her situation, and something in his chest tightened in a way he had not experienced in some time. He straightened up from the post of the livery stable and told himself very firmly that it was none of his business. He went back inside the livery and resumed his work with a young bay mare named Duchess who had been giving him trouble all week, and he put Fannie Dugan entirely out of his mind. He lasted approximately 4 minutes. Then he came back out to the street, looked in the direction of the post office, saw that she was now speaking with Martha Aldridge, the wife of the hotel keeper, and made a calculated decision to go to the general store, which was in that direction, because he needed salt and he had been meaning to get it for 3 days. He did not need salt. He had half a sack left at the bunkhouse. But he went to the general store anyway, and when he passed Martha Aldridge and the young woman with the hazel eyes and the dusty gray dress, he tipped his hat the way any decent man in Caldwell would have, and he kept walking. "Pardon me," the young woman said. Wesley stopped. He turned around slowly, the way a man turns when he is not certain whether he is being spoken to or not. "Are you from here?" she asked. She had a voice that was direct without being aggressive, like someone who had spent years learning to be heard in rooms that would have preferred to ignore her. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "I'm looking for honest work," she said. "I can sew. I can teach. I can cook a reasonable meal and keep accounts. Do you know if there's anyone in this town who might need any of those things?" Wesley looked at her for a moment. Martha Aldridge was watching this exchange with the specific attention of a woman who collected information about people the way some people collected coins. "Mi Chen at the dress shop on the south end of Main Street does alterations," he said. "She may need help. The schoolhouse lost its teacher in March, but I don't know if they've hired for fall yet. And the Cattleman's Hotel, which is behind you, serves meals, and Mrs. Aldridge there would know better than me whether she needs kitchen help." Fannie Dugan looked at him with an expression that was assessing and direct and completely unself-conscious about the fact that it was both of those things. "Thank you," she said. "That was a thorough answer." "You asked a thorough question," he said. Something shifted in her expression. Not quite a smile, but the suggestion of one, the small internal rearrangement that happens before a real smile but sometimes doesn't make it all the way to the surface. She nodded once, turned to Martha Aldridge, and resumed their conversation. Wesley went to the general store and bought the salt he didn't need, and he thought about the way she had said, "That was a thorough answer," and the thing in his chest that had tightened when she walked out of the post office tightened again, and this time it didn't loosen. The next 3 weeks established the geography of Fannie Dugan's new life in Caldwell with the particular efficiency of someone who has learned not to waste time on self-pity. Mi Chen hired her 2 days after their introduction, recognizing immediately both the quality of Fannie's needlework and the steadiness of her temperament. Mi was a remarkable woman who had come to Caldwell from San Francisco 8 years prior with her husband, Li Chen, who ran a laundry service on the east side of town. The two of them had built their small businesses from nothing in a town that was not always welcoming to them, and the quiet courage of that fact was not lost on Fannie, who found in Mi Chen the first real friendship she had made since leaving Ohio. Mi was 31, spoke with a directness that matched Fannie's own, and had opinions about everything from the best way to set a sleeve to the particular unfairness of the territorial laws that treated Chinese immigrants as something less than full persons. She expressed these opinions without bitterness, but with a clear-eyed acknowledgement of reality that Fannie recognized and respected. There were injustices woven into the fabric of this frontier life, injustices of race and gender and origin, and me wore the awareness of them the way she wore everything, with practicality and without pretending they did not exist. Fannie worked at me's dress shop in the mornings and spent 2 afternoons a week at the schoolhouse, where she had convinced the school board to let her fill in until they hired a permanent teacher. She was paid modestly for both, but modestly was enough for the room she rented above the hardware store from a widow named Clara Boggs, who charged fair rates and expected quiet evenings. She saw Wesley Keller around town with the regularity that a small community inevitably produces. He came into me's shop once to drop off a shirt that needed a button replaced, and he came in a second time to pick it up, and both times he was polite and brief and paid without complaint. She saw him at the church on Sunday mornings, sitting 3 rows from the back on the left side, which was where she also sat because the afternoon light came in at the best angle for reading the hymn books. She saw him at the general store, at the livery, and once at the far end of Main Street, trying to convince a particularly opinionated brown mule to walk through a gate, which she watched for longer than she intended because there was something genuinely interesting about the patience he brought to the task. The way he spoke to the animal in a low, even voice, never forcing, never rushing, just talking the mule through its anxiety until it made the decision on its own terms. She thought about that later. The patience of it. The first real conversation they had happened at the edge of the south pasture that ran behind the livery stable, on an evening in late April when the sky over Caldwell was doing the extraordinary thing that Kansas skies do in spring, turning itself into a canvas of amber and rose and deep violet that made every building and person and blade of grass look temporary and precious in the same moment. Fannie had taken to walking the pasture trail in the evenings because it was the only place in town that felt spacious enough to think clearly, and she had not anticipated finding Wesley Keller there with a young sorrel gelding on a long lead, working the animal in slow circles in the golden light. She almost turned back. She was not certain she wanted company. Then the gelding shied at something, a rabbit in the grass, most likely, and Wesley moved with the rope with such immediate, fluid naturalness that the horse never felt the anxiety in the line, just felt the guidance, and settled before it had fully startled. It was a thing she had never seen done so well, and she made a small, involuntary sound of appreciation that was quieter than she intended and considerably louder than she needed it to be in the evening stillness. Wesley turned his head without letting the gelding feel the shift in his attention, and he saw her standing at the fence. "Evening," he said. "Evening," she said. "I didn't mean to interrupt, I was walking." "You're not interrupting," he said. "He's about done for today anyway." He brought the gelding in gradually, letting the circles grow smaller and slower, and then stood quietly with the horse for a moment before leading him toward the fence where Fannie was standing. Up close, the gelding was beautiful, a deep, warm chestnut with a white blaze running the length of his face, young and nervous and clearly intelligent. He stretched his nose toward Fannie with the tentative curiosity of an animal that has been treated kindly and expects, on the basis of that experience, that the world will generally continue to be reasonable. "What's his name?" she asked, raising her hand slowly and letting the horse take his time deciding about her. "Duke," Wesley said, "though he hasn't grown into it yet. He's 3, still figuring out what he's for." "Aren't we all?" Fannie said, and the horse pressed his nose into her palm, and she felt the warm animal weight of that contact, and something in her that had been held very tightly for several months loosened by a fraction. Wesley watched the way she let the horse set the pace, watched the ease of her with the animal, and he revised a small internal assessment he hadn't realized he'd been making. He had already concluded in the 3 weeks since her arrival that Fannie Dugan was competent and direct and not given to foolishness. He was now adding something else to that list that he did not yet have a precise name for. "You're from Ohio," Elias said. Wesley said, because the alternative was standing in companionable silence, which he wanted to do but which seemed premature. "Cincinnati originally," she said, "and then Wichita for a year and a half, and now here." She said it without drama, just the facts of her geography. "What was in Wichita?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment in a way that was not evasive but thoughtful, as if she were deciding exactly how honest she wanted to be. "Work," she said, and then a decision. He waited. "I answered an advertisement," she said, "for a mail-order situation. A cattle rancher here in Caldwell named Gerald Hooper." She looked at the horse rather than at Wesley when she said it, which he understood was not avoidance but simply the comfort of a neutral focal point when saying something that was personal. "He passed before I arrived. I knew Gerald Hooper," Wesley said. "He was a decent man." "I heard that from several people," she said. "I'm sorry he's gone," she meant it. She had never met him, but she had corresponded with him for 3 months, and she had formed a genuine picture of a person trying to build something real and good. And she had grieved that loss with the particular sadness of a future that had existed in letters, and then had not existed at all. "And you stayed," Wesley said. "I had $11.40 and no particular reason to go back," she said, and now she did look at him, and there was a dry, quiet humor in the edges of her expression that he found unexpectedly disarming. "Mi Chen is a better employer than I've had in some time, and the prairie is louder than I expected." "Louder?" he said. "The wind," she said. "The grass. You can hear the sky changing." She looked out across the south pasture where the amber light was deepening toward violet, and the Kansas evening was doing that thing it did where it seemed to be breathing. "In Cincinnati, the city covers it up. Here it just is." He looked at the same horizon she was looking at, and it occurred to him that he had stopped actually seeing it some years ago, the way you stop seeing the face of your own house after you have lived in it long enough. "I grew up about 40 miles southeast of here," he said. "Came to Caldwell 7 years ago. I've been looking at that sky my whole life, and I can't tell you the last time I heard it the way you're describing it." "You will now that I've said it," she said. He looked at her. "That's how it works," she said matter-of-factly. "Once someone gives you a word for a thing, you can hear it." He thought about that for a long moment while the horse stood between them and the sky kept changing. "I expect you're right," he said. They stood there for another 10 minutes talking about nothing that was not easy to talk about the town, about Mi Chen's work, about the school board's difficulty finding a teacher willing to take the fall term, about the relative merits of the 2 different routes the Kishom Trail took depending on the year and the water levels. They talked like 2 people who are discovering that conversation with this particular other person is more interesting than they had prepared themselves for. And when Fannie said she should get back before it was full dark and said goodnight and walked back along the fence toward town, Wesley stood with Duke for a long time after she was gone, and the horse nudged him once in the shoulder as if to confirm something. "I know," Wesley said quietly, which was an absurd thing to say to a horse. He went back to the bunkhouse and could not concentrate on the month's accounting, and went to bed early and lay awake listening to the wind move through the grass and hearing, for the first time in years, the sky changing. May arrived, and with it, the first significant cattle drives through Caldwell, which transformed the town from a quiet frontier settlement into something considerably more chaotic and vivid. Texas cowboys came up the trail with thousands of longhorn cattle, and the particular brand of restlessness that men develop after months on the road. And the saloons filled up, and the streets filled up, and the whole town vibrated with the energy of commerce and danger and freedom. Wesley worked double hours at the livery, taking in horses from the trail drives that needed attention, reshoeing, rest, treatment for trail injuries. And he barely saw Fannie for 2 weeks, though he thought about her with an irritating and involuntary regularity. He finally saw her on a Saturday afternoon, when a cattle drive arrived with more drama than usual. A young steer had broken from the herd on the edge of town and gone straight through the main street at full speed, scattering people and overturning a vegetable cart, and causing no small amount of screaming before two cowboys managed to rope it down in front of the hotel. Wesley had come out of the livery to help assess whether the animal was injured and found Fannie Dugan already there, calmly assisting an older woman who had fallen trying to get out of the steer's path, helping her up from the dirt with firm hands and checking her carefully for injury. The older woman was Harriet Boone, wife of the local druggist, and she was shaken but unhurt, and Fannie settled her onto the boardwalk and said things to her in a voice that was low and steady and thoroughly reassuring, and then looked up and saw Wesley across the recovered steer, and the look she gave him was rueful and briefly amused, as if they had just shared a joke about the general character of life in Caldwell. He crossed over to her when Harriet Boone's husband arrived to take her home. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I wasn't the one in the steer's path," she said. "You were close enough," he said. She had a streak of dust across her left cheek and a small tear in the hem of her skirt where it had caught on something in the scramble, and she was entirely composed. "I'm fine, Wesley," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name, and he felt it land with a small, distinct warmth that was entirely disproportionate to its cause. "Good," he said. She brushed the dust from her cheek with the back of her hand. "Will the steer be all right?" "Think so," he said. "Probably more frightened than hurt." "I know the feeling," she said, and she said it lightly, but there was something underneath the lightness that he caught and filed away carefully, the genuine acknowledgement of a person who had also had a time of being more frightened than anyone could see. "There's a social at the church next Saturday," he said. It came out more abruptly than he intended, startled out of him by some part of his brain that had been planning this approach for 2 weeks and had apparently decided the middle of a cattle recovery was the appropriate moment. She looked at him. "I was wondering if you might want to go," he said, "with me, as company." The pause that followed was not long. It was the pause of a woman taking something seriously rather than dismissing it. "All right," she said. "Yes, I'd like that." He nodded. He was aware that he was smiling in a way that was probably more obvious than dignity allowed, and he was not immediately capable of doing anything about it. "Saturday at 6, he said. "I'll be at Me's until 5, she said. "You can meet me there." He tipped his hat and went back to the livery, and spent the rest of the afternoon being more careful and precise about his work than was strictly necessary, because he needed somewhere to put the particular restless energy that had arrived in his chest. The church social was held on the last Saturday of May, and the whole of Caldwell that was inclined toward such things turned out for it with the communal enthusiasm of a town that understood the value of a good evening in company. Reverend Allen had the pews moved back and the floor cleared, and several of the ranching wives had brought food that made the inside of the church smell like butter and apple and fresh bread, and someone had brought a fiddle player from out of town who set up in the corner and began filling the room with the particular kind of music that makes feet want to move regardless of whether the feet's owner has given permission. Wesley had been to church socials in Caldwell before. He had attended them the way he attended most social obligations in town, with a willingness to be present and a general alertness that never entirely left him, even in peaceful settings. He was not accustomed to walking into a room with someone he was specifically glad to be walking in with, and the difference between those two experiences was larger than he had estimated. Fannie wore a blue dress that Mi Chen had helped her alter. She had confessed this to Wesley on the walk over with the dry humor that he was rapidly coming to regard as one of his favorite things about her, saying that it was both the advantage and the hazard of working for a dressmaker, that you were always borrowing your own skill to fix your own clothes. The blue brought out something in her hazel eyes that the gray traveling dress had not, and Wesley had looked at her when she came out of Mi's door, and had felt the thing in his chest do something complicated that he declined to examine too carefully in the moment. They ate the church food and talked to the people they knew, and Wesley introduced her to a few people she hadn't yet met: Ben Aldridge, who ran the hotel; Tom Carver, the blacksmith; old Pete Malinowski, who had ranched the county since before Caldwell existed. And he watched Fannie meet each of them with that direct, unhurried attention she brought to everything, asking questions that were genuine rather than polite, and listening to the answers with the full weight of her consideration. When the fiddle player shifted into a reel, Tom Carver's wife dragged Tom to the cleared floor, and several other couples followed. And Wesley looked at Fannie, and she looked at him and raised an eyebrow as if to say, well, he was not an exceptional dancer. He had a reasonable sense of rhythm and no self-consciousness about it, which was most of the skill, and Fannie danced the way she did most things, competently, fully present, occasionally laughing at the fiddle player's embellishments with a laugh that was unguarded and real, and that Wesley stored carefully in some internal archive he was assembling without quite meaning to. They danced twice and then stood together at the edge of the room catching their breath, and the evening had turned to full dark outside, and the lamplight in the church was warm and gold and made everyone look like something from a painting, and Wesley thought with a clarity he had not experienced in a long time that he was happy. Not content, which was what he usually was. Happy. "I'm glad I stayed in Caldwell," Fannie said. She was not looking at him when she said it. She was looking at the room, at the people and the lamplight and the fiddle player, but he knew somehow that she was including him in the radius of what she meant, and he felt that knowledge settle into him like something permanent. "I'm glad, too," he said quietly, "for entirely selfish reasons." She turned and looked at him then with an expression that was open and warm and a little surprised, and he realized that she had not been certain he would say that she had perhaps been hoping for it without being certain of it, and that the certainty had arrived on his face before his words had finished forming. "Wesley Keller," she said, with a gravity that was also slightly playful. "Are you attempting to court me?" "I believe I am," he said. "If that's all right." She held his gaze for a moment that felt suspended, the way the best moments tend to feel, as if time has decided to be generous for once. "It's all right," she said. He smiled, and she smiled back, and the fiddle player launched into something jubilant, and the evening went on around them, and between them there was now a thing that had been named, which, as Fannie had told him, was how things became real. June came in warm and dry, and full of the particular beauty of the Kansas prairie in early summer, when the blue stem grass runs waist-high, and the meadowlarks are loud in the morning, and the whole enormous sky seems to be paying attention to something. Wesley and Fannie began the careful and mutually respectful process of learning each other's rhythms, which in the frontier context of 1879 Caldwell meant primarily that they took their evening walks together, and he came by Me's shop on the days she worked late, and they sat in the church pew 3 rows from the back on Sunday mornings and shared the hymn book. He learned that she had grown up in a household with 3 brothers who had taught her inadvertently to hold her own in any argument, and deliberately to mend a fence and drive a wagon. He learned that she had been engaged once before, at 20, to a young man in Cincinnati who had broken the engagement when her father's business failed, and that she had drawn from this experience not bitterness, but a very clear-eyed understanding of who she was willing to be made vulnerable for and under what conditions. He learned that she read whenever she could, that she had opinions about the land question and the cattle business, and the treatment of the Comanche peoples who had been pushed off the southern plains by the same expansion that had built Caldwell and every town like it, and that she expressed these opinions without apology, but also without the expectation that everyone would agree with her. She learned that Wesley had come to Caldwell at 20 from a farming family that had struggled and eventually lost their land to drought and debt, and that he had arrived with nothing except an unusual gift, with horses that he had discovered at the age of 12, and that had been his livelihood and his anchor ever since. She learned that he had a younger sister named Clara in Wichita, a different Clara from her landlady, who was married with 2 small children, and that he visited her twice a year and wrote more often than most brothers of his acquaintance. She learned that he was quiet in the specific way of someone who has learned that words are valuable and should not be spent carelessly, but that when he did speak at length it was worth waiting for. She learned that he was patient with animals in a way that extended, when you watched carefully, to his patience with people. The same low, steady quality, the same willingness to let things come to their own conclusions without forcing. She found this, in the quiet of her own reflection, to be the most attractive thing about him, and she was a woman honest enough with herself to know the precise nature of what she was feeling. On a Thursday evening in mid-June, they were sitting on the fence at the south pasture watching Duke and two other young horses running the last of the daylight out of themselves, and the conversation had been easy and wide-ranging, and had arrived, by the natural drift of two people genuinely interested in each other, at the subject of what they each wanted from the years ahead. They were sitting side by side on the top rail of the fence, close enough that their shoulders were almost touching in the way that almost touching can be more present and deliberate than actual contact. "I want a permanent thing," Fannie said. She said it plainly, looking at the horses. "I'm not interested in provisional. I came west because I wanted to build something that was mine, a home, a life with someone I respect and who respects me, work that matters." She paused. "I've seen what provisional looks like. My father built his whole life on borrowed ground, and when the note came due, everything went with it. I want something real." Wesley was quiet for a moment, and in his quiet there was the feeling not of discomfort but of serious consideration, as if he were weighing what she had said against his own architecture and finding the measurements compatible. "I've been building the livery into a proper training operation for 3 years," he said. "I own the land it's on. I have a contract with 2 ranches to train their cutting horses and one with the county to board the sheriff's remuda. Another year, maybe 2, it's enough to support a family." He looked at the horses. "I'm not talking about wealthy, but stable, something real." The word real passed between them like an exchange of currency. "I know," she said quietly. "I can see that you're building something." He turned his head and looked at her then, and the evening light was warm on her face, and her eyes when they met his were direct and open, and he felt himself understood in a way that was both entirely new and entirely like coming home. "Fannie," he said. "Wesley," she said, and the way she said his name had an exact warmth in it that he recognized as something he needed to hear. He leaned in slowly, and she did not lean back, and the kiss he gave her was quiet and deliberate, and it lasted just long enough to be a real thing and not a question, and when he pulled back she was looking at him with an expression that he catalogued and kept. "All right," she said softly. "All right," he agreed. Duke ran the length of the pasture in the gold evening light, and the meadowlarks were loud in the grass, and everything in that moment was perfectly and exactly what it was. July in Caldwell was not gentle. The heat pressed down on the town with the serious intention of a place that had never agreed to be inhabited by human beings, and the cattle drives reached their peak volume, and the saloons ran all hours, and the streets were loud and crowded, and Wesley worked from before dawn until well past dark 6 days out of 7. But the evenings when he was not too exhausted, he made time for Fannie, and the evenings when he was too exhausted, she made time for him, sitting with him on the step of the livery while he rested, bringing him food from the hotel kitchen that Mrs. Aldridge had taken to setting aside for her with the specific approval of a woman who approved of the development she was witnessing. It was in July that Fannie met Wesley's sister Clara, who came down from Wichita for a week's visit with her husband James and their 2 children, a 4-year-old boy named Samuel and a 1-year-old girl named Ruth. Clara Keller, Clara Marsh now, was 24, with Wesley's same dark eyes and a lively, direct quality that made Fannie feel immediately comfortable. They liked each other within the first hour, which Clara later told her brother was the best possible outcome and the clearest possible sign, because Clara had strong opinions about the women in Wesley's vicinity, and had exercised a powerful veto on at least 2 prior occasions. "He talks about you in his letters," Clara told Fannie on the second day of her visit, while they sat in the shade outside me's dress shop waiting for Wesley to finish at the livery. "He's not an emotional correspondent in general. 3 sentences about the horses, 1 sentence about the weather, but you get your own paragraph." Fannie looked at her hands to conceal whatever was happening on her face. "He doesn't know I told you that," Clara said. "He doesn't need to," Fannie said. Clara grinned in a way that was entirely her brother's grin, just warmer and quicker to arrive. "I'm glad he found you," she said. "I've been worrying about him." "He seems very capable of managing on his own," Fannie said. "Managing, yes," Clara said. "Being happy, that's different. He's been managing since our parents' farm went under. He manages very well, but I want more than managing for him." Fannie was quiet for a moment. "So do I," she said, and she said it with a certainty that had not been there 3 months ago and was now as settled as the ground beneath her feet. The Sunday after Clara left, Wesley and Fannie took a longer walk than usual after church, following the creek trail east out of town into the open prairie. It was a Sunday morning in late July, and the heat was already serious by 9 in the morning, but there was a breeze from the north that made it bearable, and the creek showed green cottonwoods against the endless blue of the sky, and it was the kind of morning that makes you understand why people stayed in Kansas, even when Kansas was difficult. They walked for a while in the comfortable silence that had become one of their natural registers, and then Wesley said, quietly and without preamble, "I'd like to ask you to marry me." Fannie stopped walking. He stopped too, a step ahead of her, and turned back. His face was careful and open in the way it only was with her, the usual reserve set down like a hat you don't need inside. "I know this is a serious thing," he said. "I know you've made decisions about this kind of thing carefully, and I know we've known each other only a few months. But I also know, with more certainty than I've felt about anything in a considerable time, that I want to build that real thing with you. The permanent thing. I want to build it with you specifically." She was looking at him with those hazel eyes that could hold so much without spilling any of it, and he could see the emotion in them, but he could not yet read the shape of her answer, and he made himself stand still and wait, the way he waited for horses, the way he waited for anything that mattered. "Yes," she said. "Wesley, yes." The word yes in her voice, with that weight and that warmth, was the best single syllable he had ever heard in his life. He crossed the step between them and took her face in both hands and kissed her with everything that had been building since the evening at the south pasture fence. And she put her hands on his chest and kissed him back just as fully. And the cottonwoods rustled in the July breeze, and the creek ran on past them, and the meadowlarks were absolutely deafening. They were married in September of 1879 at the Caldwell church, on a Saturday morning when the prairie had turned its autumn gold, and the air had the clean, sharp quality of early fall. Reverend Allen performed the ceremony, and most of the town turned out for it because a wedding in Caldwell in 1879 was a community event, and also because Fannie and Wesley had both made the kinds of friendships that fill a church. Chen sat in the front row with her husband Lee, both of them dressed with the care they brought to important occasions, and Clara came down from Wichita again with James and the children, and Harriet Boone was there with her husband, and Tom Carver the blacksmith, and Elias Prout the postmaster who had given Fannie the glass of water and the bad news on the day she arrived, and had never stopped being sorry about the one and grateful for the other. Fannie wore the blue dress from the church social, altered by me with the kind of loving precision that is its own form of blessing, with a wreath of prairie wildflowers in her hair that she had gathered herself at dawn from the creek trail. Wesley stood at the front of the church in his best shirt and jacket with an expression that was absolutely undisguised, not composed, not careful, just happy, plainly and entirely, in a way that made several people in the congregation quietly and privately reassess their own arrangements and find them wanting by comparison. When Reverend Allen asked if they took each other, They both said yes with a clarity and a conviction that filled the whole room, and when Wesley was invited to kiss his bride, he cupped her face in both hands the way he had at the creek trail, and she put her hands over his, and the room made the particular collective sound of a group of people who are simultaneously moved and delighted. After the ceremony, there was food at the Hotel Mrs. Aldridge had outdone herself, and music from the same fiddle player who had played at the church social, and dancing that went on until dark. And Wesley danced with Fannie, and Fannie danced with Lee Chen, who turned out to be an accomplished dancer. And Wesley danced with Clara and made her cry a little, which she would have denied under any examination. And the whole evening was the kind of evening that people in small towns talk about for years afterward, not because anything extraordinary happened in it, but because everything ordinary happened in it with exactly the right people. They moved into Wesley's property at the edge of town, which was a substantial piece of land with the livery and training operation at the front, and a solidly built house behind it that Wesley had been improving incrementally for 4 years, in the unspoken preparation of a man who knows what he's building toward even when he doesn't know for whom. The house had 2 real rooms and a kitchen and a porch that faced west, which meant they had a good view of every sunset, and Fannie began immediately the process of making it hers as well as his, which required primarily the rearrangement of several items of furniture that Wesley had placed entirely according to function, and not at all according to light, a fact she pointed out with such accuracy and humor that he moved everything exactly as she suggested, and found the rooms immediately more comfortable, which he declined to admit directly, but which she understood from the way he occupied the spaces afterward. The autumn of 1879 was a season of settling into their life together, which was both ordinary and extraordinary in the way that all truly good things are. Wesley trained his horses, and Fannie continued at Me's shop and at the school, where she had been officially hired for the fall term when the school board had finally abandoned their search for someone else and acknowledged that they had the best available teacher already there. She taught 11 children ranging in age from 5 to 14 in the one-room schoolhouse, and she loved it with the whole of her considerable capacity for engagement. The variety of it, the daily challenge of it, the specific pleasure of watching a child arrive at an understanding they had not previously had. In the evenings they sat on the western porch and watched the sky change and talked about the day, and sometimes Wesley read while Fannie graded papers, and sometimes Fannie read while Wesley worked on whatever piece of tack needed attention, and sometimes they didn't read or work, but just sat together in the comfortable presence of 2 people who have made the right choice and know it. They were not without difficulty. The winter of 1879 to 1880 was hard in southern Kansas, as winters sometimes were, and there were weeks when the cold made the training work nearly impossible and the income slowed. And there was one week in February when a mysterious cough went through the town, and Wesley caught it badly enough that Fannie stayed up 2 nights in a row to manage his fever with cold cloths and the herb teas that Mi Chen's husband Lee provided from his family's knowledge. Speaking quietly to Wesley through the nights in the dark room while the wind pulled at the house, telling him about the day and about things she was planning for the school, and about the letter she'd received from her brother Thomas in Cincinnati, keeping her voice steady and warm until the fever broke and he looked at her with exhausted, grateful eyes that said more than he had the strength to put into words. "You didn't have to stay up," he told her the next morning, hoarse and pale but himself again. "I know I didn't have to," she said, handing him broth from the kitchen stove. "That's rather the point." He looked at her over the broth, and the gratitude on his face was so complete and unguarded that she had to look away for a moment because it was, in its honesty, almost too much to hold. By spring of 1880, the training operation had expanded enough that Wesley hired a young hand named Eli Turner, who was 18 and good with horses, and earnest in the particular way of young men who are trying to prove themselves, and don't yet know they don't have to. Eli had grown up on a small ranch south of the Arkansas River and had heard about Wesley Keller's operation the way young people in that part of the country heard about things, by reputation carried on the general current of information that moved between ranches and trails and towns. He was a good hire, honest and willing to learn, and Fannie liked him immediately because he reminded her of her youngest brother in Ohio, that combination of confidence and uncertainty that is specific to 18. There was a problem in the spring of 1880 that was more serious than a bad winter or a slow month. The problem had a name: Harold Prout. Harold Prout was a rancher from the western edge of the county, who had been in a long simmering dispute with Wesley over a matter of property line that had begun before Fannie arrived in Caldwell. The short version was that Prout claimed a strip of land along the north edge of Wesley's property that he insisted had been included in a sale some years prior, and that Wesley had documentation clearly establishing was not. The dispute had been a civil annoyance for years, occasionally escalating to loud exchanges, and once to a formal complaint to the county sheriff, which had been resolved in Wesley's favor. Prout did not accept resolutions in his favor when someone else received them. In April of 1880, Prout began running cattle across the disputed strip deliberately, damaging the north fence and twice causing minor chaos when the cattle got into the yard near the training operation and spooked the horses. Wesley addressed this with the formal patience that was his nature: a written complaint to the sheriff, a documented account of the damage, a request for formal mediation. He did not escalate to anger. He did not threaten. He built a record. Prout then made the mistake of coming to the property while Wesley was out at a far pasture and speaking to Fannie. Whatever Prout had expected from this encounter, perhaps a woman who would be more easily unsettled, or who would pass his message back to Wesley in a diminished form. He had clearly not accounted for Fannie Keller, who had grown up with 3 brothers and had spent 2 years in Wichita and had answered a mail-order advertisement and started her life over and taught 11 children, and was not in any measurable way easily unsettled. Prout told her, standing in the yard of her own home, that Wesley should give up the land in question because fighting over it would cost more than it was worth. Fannie looked at Harold Prout with the full weight of her clear-eyed attention and said, "Mr. Prout, my husband has the documentation to prove that land is ours, and the sheriff's office has already acknowledged that fact. If you have a new legal argument, I'd suggest you bring it to the county courthouse. If you'd like to leave cattle on our property again, I'll note the date and number and add it to the record we're building. Either way, I'll let Wesley know you came by." Prout left. Wesley was quietly and completely proud when she told him, in the way of a man who did not need his wife to fight his battles but who recognized, with something warmer than pride, that he had married someone who was his equal in every way that mattered. The matter was formally resolved in June of 1880 when the county court, presented with Wesley's documentation and the record of fence damage, ruled definitively in Wesley's favor and warned Prout that further trespass would result in financial penalty. Prout did not come near the property again, and by autumn he had sold most of his herd and retreated from the district, and the matter closed in the clean way that legal resolutions sometimes do when the facts are clearly on one side. The summer of 1880 was the happiest summer Wesley Keller had known since boyhood, and he would have told you so without hesitation, which was not a thing he would have said about any previous summer without considerable internal preparation. The training operation was running well. Eli Turner had become a genuine asset, and the house behind the livery had become, fully and unmistakably, a home. Fannie had planted a kitchen garden on the south side of the house that was producing tomatoes and beans with the particular enthusiasm of Kansas soil that has never been told it can't, and the porch in the evenings was a place of real peace, and the life they had built together had the quality that Fannie had described on the creek trail the morning he proposed. It was real. In September, Fannie told him she was pregnant. She told him on the porch after dinner, directly, and with the composure she brought to all significant information. And he sat very still for a moment with the expression of a man who has been told something so exactly right that his whole system is taking a moment to integrate it. Then he said, "Fannie," in a voice that had nothing composed about it at all, and she laughed at the look on his face, and he reached for her hand and held it with both of his and could not for a full minute find additional words. "I know," she said, which covered everything he couldn't say. The baby was born in the spring of 1881, on an April morning when the prairie was still cool enough for comfort, but the first wildflowers were already in the grass along the creek trail. It was a boy, which surprised Wesley slightly because he had for some reason assumed a girl, and the surprise lasted approximately 30 seconds before being replaced entirely by a completely wordless and consuming love of a kind he had not known was available to him. They named him Thomas James Keller, Thomas for Fannie's brother in Cincinnati and James for Wesley's brother-in-law, and he arrived in the world with dark eyes that looked like Wesley's and a disposition toward loudness that seemed initially alarming, and then gradually revealed itself to be simply enthusiasm, the energy of a person who has things to say and does not intend to wait. Mi Chen came to see the baby within the first week and held him with the careful tenderness of a woman who knows babies and loves them, and told Fannie he was magnificent, which was the precise word that fit. Clara came from Wichita in May and cried again, and this time acknowledged it openly, telling Wesley that if he tried to tease her about it, she would enumerate several of his own moments of visible feeling that she had been cataloging for years. Thomas grew through the summer of 1881 with the velocity that infants have, which is astonishing to anyone who watches it up close. The daily transformations, the morning revelations of new capability, the specific joy of a baby who has just discovered that the world responds to him. Wesley, who had always been better at patience than at expression, turned out to be an extraordinary father in the particular way of people who show up fully and consistently, and without performance. He could quiet Thomas in minutes with the same low, even voice he used with the horses, talking the baby through his anxiety until Thomas made the decision, on his own terms, to stop crying. Fannie watched this and loved it without reservation. The school continued in the fall of 1881, with Fannie returning to teaching after the summer with the help of Mi Chen's recommendation of a young Mennonite woman named Anna Schroeder who came in the mornings to watch Thomas. And this arrangement worked well enough that the school board renewed her contract for a second year, and then a third. Eli Turner, their young hand, had been quietly and steadily growing over those 2 years from a boy trying to prove himself into a young man of genuine skill and reliability. Wesley had given him more and more responsibility, and by the fall of 1881, Eli was managing the day-to-day operations of the training stable with an independence that allowed Wesley to take on more contract work with the bigger ranches. More than that, Eli had developed an attachment to the Keller household that was more than professional. He ate Sunday meals with them, played with Thomas with the gentle enthusiasm of a young man who had grown up as the youngest sibling and missed being an older one, and had come to occupy that specific human role of someone who is not family by blood, but who is family by choice and time and mutual regard. It was through Eli that a second significant development arrived in the Keller story in the autumn of 1882. Eli had been corresponding for some months with a young woman in Wichita named Grace Albright, the daughter of a harness maker, and in October he arrived at the livery on a Monday morning with an expression that Wesley recognized immediately because he had worn it himself. "Something's happened," Wesley said. "I asked Grace to come to Caldwell," Eli said, "as my wife. I asked if she'd consider, as a prospect." He was 20 years old and deeply flustered, which was charming. "What did she say?" Wesley asked. "She said yes," Eli said. "She said yes, and she's coming in January." Wesley put down the brushes he was holding and looked at his young hand, and felt the particular, complicated warmth of a man watching a younger person step into the best version of their own future. And he shook Eli's hand and told him he was glad. And when he told Fannie that evening, she immediately began planning how to make Grace Albright feel welcomed in Caldwell, the way Mi Chen and Martha Aldridge had made her feel welcomed 3 years before. Grace Albright arrived in January of 1883 on the Wichita stage, a small, sharp-eyed, practical woman of 20 who had her father's hands and her mother's humor and who stepped off the stage and took one look at Caldwell's Main Street in winter, brown and cold and considerably less impressive than it was in the cattle season, and said to Eli, who was standing there with his hat in his hands, "You told me in your letters it was a good town." "It is a good town," Eli said, anxious. "I'm teasing you," Grace said. "Come here." And she kissed him on the cheek right there on the main street in front of the whole town that was watching, which sent every watching person's opinion of her immediately to the highest possible mark. Eli Turner and Grace Albright were married in March of 1883, and Fannie and Wesley stood with them at the church the way that people who have found each other's rhythm stand with others who are finding theirs, with a warmth that was both personal and generous, the warmth of people who know what is beginning and are glad to witness it. The years between 1883 and 1885 were the years of the life finding its full shape, which is the quieter and more important work that comes after the dramatic early scenes of building. Wesley's training operation became genuinely established in those years, known through the ranching community of southern Kansas as one of the best operations of its kind, and the contracts multiplied enough that he and Eli were working steadily through every season and looking toward expanding the stable again. Fannie's school had grown to 15 students by 1884, and she had successfully petitioned the school board for a second teacher, a young man named David Park, a graduate of the Kansas State Normal School, who brought an energy and academic rigor that complemented her own approach, and with whom she built the kind of collegial respect that makes an institution work. The injustices of the period were not invisible from the window of their life. The displacement of the Comanche and the Kiowa from the southern plains had been accomplished through a combination of military force and treaty breaking that left a silence in the land where there had been a different kind of life. Wesley had grown up knowing old men who remembered the plains differently, and the awareness of what had been taken to make room for what now existed was something he carried with a sober responsibility, without pretending it erased the value of what he had built, but without pretending it didn't exist either. Fannie addressed it in her classroom directly. She taught the history of the land in a way that acknowledged its full complexity, which made some parents uncomfortable, and which she addressed with her characteristic straightforwardness, explaining that she intended to educate children to see clearly because a person who sees clearly is more useful to the world than one who doesn't. Mi Chen came to her classroom once to speak to the students about her own family's experience coming to America, about the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 that had passed with the specific intention of preventing people like her from belonging, about what it meant to build a life in a place that had legally decided you did not deserve one. It was not an easy visit for the classroom. Several children went home with questions that their parents were not entirely prepared for. Wesley and Fannie talked about it that evening on the porch and agreed that the discomfort was the point, that children who could sit with discomfort and ask honest questions were children who might eventually do something about the conditions that produced them. The second child arrived in the summer of 1884, a girl this time, born in July with the heat sitting on the house like a hand. They named her Clara Mi Keller, Clara for Wesley's sister, Mi for the woman who had given Fannie her first friendship in Kansas, which was a name that contained in it the whole history of how their life had come to be what it was. Clara Mi had her mother's hazel eyes, and as it became apparent in the months following, her mother's decisive disposition and her father's patience, which was a combination that made her simultaneously very easy and very interesting to manage. Thomas, who was 3 when his sister arrived, took to her with the wholehearted older brother enthusiasm of a child who has been only and is glad to no longer be. He assigned himself the role of Clara Mee's primary guide to the world, and took this role with a seriousness that made both parents privately delighted, explaining to her with great thoroughness the names of all the horses and the purpose of different tools, and the sound that the meadowlarks made in the morning, even while she was too young to do more than watch him with the wide-eyed regard of a very small person confronting an extremely energetic world. By the fall of 1885, the life that Fannie had described on the Creek Trail in 1879, the real, permanent thing was not only built but inhabited and full. The house behind the livery had been extended twice to accommodate the family, and had a proper kitchen garden and a porch where Thomas sometimes slept on warm nights when Wesley carried him out there, and told him the names of the stars, most of which Thomas promptly renamed according to his own system. The training operation employed 3 men now, including Eli Turner, who had settled into his role with the ease of someone who has found his right place, and Grace Turner had become one of Fannie's closest friends, the 2 women sharing the particular companionship of people who arrived in Caldwell within a few years of each other, and had built their lives from something like nothing into something solid. Duke, the sorrel gelding that had been the occasion of their first real conversation, was now 6 years old and had grown into his name, a beautiful, confident, well-trained horse that Wesley used as his own primary mount, and that had come to occupy in the private symbology of the Keller's life, together a significance that both of them acknowledged with the understated humor of people who know that some symbols are too accurate to be embarrassing. When Thomas was old enough to begin learning to ride, it was Duke who carried him first, patient and careful, and Fannie stood at the fence watching her son on her husband's horse in the Kansas afternoon, and felt the compound joy of it, the layers of time and feeling stacked in the single image, with such completeness that she had to breathe through it. It was in the spring of 1886 that the formal occasion arrived that made the whole shape of the thing undeniable. The school board, responding to Caldwell's growth, voted to build a new schoolhouse larger, properly equipped, with 2 classrooms and an office. Fannie had been central to the proposal for the new building, had attended every board meeting, had brought detailed plans prepared with David Park, and had argued the case for the investment with the measured, thorough, patient completeness that was her best professional voice. When the building was completed in the fall of 1886 and the school board held a dedication, they named one of the classrooms the Keller Room for the teacher who had, in the words of board chairman Thomas Aldridge, come to Caldwell with nothing except intelligence and determination, and had built a school worth building. Fannie stood at the door of that room with her name on the frame, and felt something that she had been moving toward since she stepped off the stagecoach in 1879, with $11.40 and no plan, the certainty that she had arrived where she was meant to be. Wesley stood beside her at the dedication with Thomas on his shoulders and Clara Mee on his arm, and he watched his wife stand at the door of the room with her name on it, and he felt what he had felt on that evening at the south pasture fence in the April light of 1879, when something in his chest had tightened and not loosened. Only now it was not tight at all. It had expanded to accommodate everything that had happened since, and it fit perfectly, the way only the right things fit. After the dedication, when the town had gone home and the new schoolhouse was quiet in the autumn evening, Wesley and Fannie stood for a moment alone on the steps, Thomas having been collected by Eli and Grace, who had brought him along to their house for the evening, and Clara Mee asleep in her basket inside the school door. "I want to tell you something," Wesley said. Fannie looked at him. "When you stepped off that stagecoach in 1879, he said, "I watched you come out of the post office with your bag, and I thought you were the most determined person I had ever seen. And I told myself it was none of my business. He was not usually a man of many words, and this was more than he generally offered, and she knew it. And then I went to the general store and bought salt I didn't need. She stared at him. You didn't need the salt. I had half a sack at the bunkhouse. She started to laugh, a full laugh that was completely unguarded and entirely real, and he smiled at her with the smile that was only ever fully present with her. Wesley Keller, she said when the laughter settled, you went to the general store on a pretense. I did, he said, and I have been exceptionally grateful for it ever since. She stepped close to him and put her hand flat on his chest and looked up at him with those hazel eyes that still, after 7 years of marriage and 2 children and a room with her name on it, had the capacity to affect him with the same force as the first time he had really looked into them at the south pasture fence. So have I, she said, every single day. He put his arm around her, and she leaned into him, and the autumn evening settled over Caldwell, Kansas, soft and gold, and the prairie stretched away in every direction to the enormous horizon, and the sky was doing the thing that Kansas skies do, the particular vast and luminous thing that Fannie had told him once you could hear if you listened, and he listened now with everything he had, and he could. The years passed with the particular quality of good years, full and varied and sometimes difficult and consistently, genuinely worth the living. Thomas at 7 was in the school where his mother taught, and had the specific complex relationship with that fact that children of teachers universally have proud and embarrassed and determined to demonstrate that he was not receiving any special treatment, which he was not, because Fannie was too fair a teacher for that, and also probably held him to a slightly higher standard than anyone else, which was its own form of love. He was strong and quick, and had his father's eye for animals and his mother's directness, and he had taken to spending his weekend hours at the stable with Wesley and Eli, learning the training work with a seriousness that Wesley watched with a quiet, enormous pride. Clara Me at 4 was a force of nature, opinionated, affectionate, and possessed of a conversational energy that filled whatever room she was in with the specific music of a person who has discovered that the world is interesting and intends to explore all of it. She had her mother's hazel eyes and her father's voice, low and warm, and she called the horses by their names with a certainty that made Eli Turner say, once, that he wasn't sure if she was 4 years old or 40, which was the correct observation. Mi Chen and Fannie's friendship deepened over those years into the kind of friendship that is one of the most important things in a person's life and often goes unnamed because it doesn't fit the narratives that get told about what matters. They had lunch together on Thursdays when Fannie's school schedule permitted, at Mi's shop or sometimes at the hotel, and they talked about everything about work and children and the changes in the town and the world beyond it, about the laws that affected Mi's family, and the ways the frontier was ceasing to be a frontier as more people arrived and more structures settled in. They talked about what it meant to make a life in a place that had not originally made room for you, and about the particular dignity of having made it anyway. Li Chen's laundry business had expanded enough by 1887 that he employed 3 people, and had a contract with the hotel and 2 of the larger ranches, and the Chens had built a proper house on the east side of town that Li had designed himself with a mixture of the Western building conventions. He had learned in certain details that were the expression of a different inheritance, a private and permanent declaration that he existed fully in this place and fully in himself. Fannie had visited the house many times and always found something new to notice and appreciate in it, the way you can always find something new in the work of a person who has thought carefully about what they are making. In 1888, Wesley received a letter from a rancher in Texas named Ambrose Carlisle, a man who had heard of the Caldwell operation through 3 separate recommendations, and who wanted to hire Wesley to spend 6 weeks in the summer working with a herd of young cutting horses on his ranch in the Texas Panhandle. The money was exceptional, the best single contract Wesley had ever been offered, and it would fund the second barn expansion he had been planning for 2 years. The difficulty was 6 weeks away from Fannie and the children. They discussed it with the honest practicality that was their default mode for everything important. The money was real and the opportunity was genuine, and Eli Turner was fully capable of managing the Caldwell operation in Wesley's absence. The school was running its best year under Fannie and David Park. Thomas was 7 and Clara Mee was 4, and both of them were sturdy and well. There was no logical reason to refuse. "Go," Fannie said. "We'll be fine." "6 weeks is a long time," he said. "It is," she agreed. "And we'll write to each other. You'll come back with enough to build the second barn, and I will have had the experience of discovering definitively whether I can run this household without you, which I am moderately certain I can, and will be glad to confirm." He looked at her. "You're already certain," he said. "Yes," she said, "but there is a difference between certain and confirmed." He went to Texas in June of 1888 and worked the Carlisle Ranch for 6 weeks in the Texas heat. And he wrote to Fannie twice a week with the letters of a man who is, as Clara had once observed, not an emotional correspondent in general, except that these letters were long and detailed, and contained, between the lines of their practicality, the whole clear shape of how much he missed his wife. Fannie wrote back with the letters of a woman who is managing a household and a school and 2 children and finding, exactly as she had predicted, that she can do it, and whose letters also contained, in their own careful idiom, the same clear shape. He came home in late July of 1888 on the afternoon stage, arriving in the golden late afternoon light that had been the light of so many of the most significant moments of his life in Caldwell. And Thomas was at the stage stop waiting for him, because Thomas had appointed himself the family's official advance team, and taken this responsibility completely seriously. Wesley stepped down from the stage into the dusty Caldwell afternoon, and his 7-year-old son collided with him at full speed, and he lifted the boy and held him and felt, in the specific weight of a child who is yours, the whole geography of what he had been missing. And then Fannie was there, coming across the street in the afternoon light with Clara Mee on her hip, and she was walking toward him with the directness and warmth and total lack of performance that was the truest thing about her. And he set Thomas down and crossed the remaining distance, and she transferred Clara Mee to his arms without ceremony, and she kissed him, and he held his daughter and his wife in the same moment, and the Kansas afternoon held them all. "Confirmed," he said into her hair. "Thoroughly confirmed," she said. "I ran the household in excellent order, and I am sincerely glad you're home." "So am I," he said. The second barn was built in the fall of 1888 with the Texas money and Wesley's own labor and Eli Turner's and 2 other men from town, and it stood at the north end of the property, solid and good, built to last, built for the long business that the training operation had become. At the dedication, which was a private thing, just the Kellers and the Turners and me and Lee Chen on a Saturday morning with coffee and the particular satisfaction of a finished thing, Wesley stood at the door of the new structure and looked at the land that was his, the house and the barn and the training pastures in the Kansas autumn light, and he felt the same thing that Fannie had felt at the door of the school room with her name on the frame, the certainty of having arrived. "You built something real," Fannie said, standing beside him, her hand in his, watching the same view. "We built something real," he said. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and Clara Mee ran across the yard after Thomas, who was chasing a barn cat, with the focused enthusiasm of a child with no competing priorities. And Eli and Grace were arguing amiably about the best way to hang the new lanterns. And Mee Chen was telling Lee something that made him laugh. And the autumn sky over Caldwell was enormous and blue, and doing the thing that Fannie had told Wesley to listen for on an evening 7 years ago. And he listened to it, and it sounded exactly like this. Exactly like all of it, all of them, the whole impossible, ordinary, perfect fact of the life they had built. The winter of 1888 passed, and the spring of 1889 arrived, and with it the news that Fannie was expecting again, their 3rd child, which was received in the Keller household with the same warm certainty that had accompanied the previous two announcements. Thomas was 8 and considered himself basically an adult on the subject, and had opinions about names that he delivered at the dinner table with a conviction that was entirely his mother's. Clara Mee was 5, and had informed the household that the baby would be a girl, and that its name would be Daisy, a position she maintained with complete steadiness regardless of what anyone else thought. The baby arrived in October of 1889, another boy, which Clara Mee received with the specific betrayal of a child whose certainty has been disproven by events. She considered the baby solemnly for a full minute, and then announced that his name should be Daisy anyway, which the family declined, and after some weeks of negotiation, a name was arrived at. Samuel Wesley Keller, Samuel for Wesley's nephew in Wichita and Wesley, because Fannie said, matter-of-factly, that if Thomas had her brother's name and Clara Mee had two women's names, the youngest could have his father's, and Wesley had been so moved by this that he had been unable to speak for a moment, which was becoming increasingly common for a man who had once been so careful with his emotional exposure. Samuel arrived in the world quieter than his older siblings, which was not a deficit but a difference. A person who watched and listened before he spoke, who had from infancy the still, attentive quality that his father had in those early years when everyone called it reserve, and Fannie had recognized as depth. He was Thomas's opposite in the specific way of siblings who complement rather than compete, and Thomas took to the role of loud, directing older brother with the same energy he brought to everything. And Clara Mee, having worked through her disappointment about the name, settled into the role of middle child with a diplomacy that surprised everyone and perhaps shouldn't have, given whose daughter she was. By the time the 1890s arrived, the Keller household was a full and vivid and genuinely happy place, full of the particular noise and warmth of a family that has found its shape. Wesley's training operation was one of the best known in the region, and Fannie's school was the best in the county by general acknowledgement, and both of them had built those things from scratch in the years since a stagecoach had deposited a young woman with $11.40 and a disoriented look on a small-town Kansas street. Caldwell itself was changing. The cattle drives were diminishing as the railroads expanded and barbed wire cut across the open range, and the era of the trail drive moved toward its end. The town was quieter in some ways, more settled in others, less the wild transit point it had been, and more the permanent community that the families who had stayed and built there had always intended. Wesley watched these changes with the thoughtful attention he brought to everything, understanding them for what they were: the turning of an era, the arrival of a different kind of West, one that was more certain and less wide open than the one he had ridden into in his 20s. He did not mourn it entirely, because what it had cost and what it was still costing in land and life, and belonging for the people who had been displaced by it, was too real to permit simple nostalgia. But he acknowledged privately that the particular quality of the frontier, its openness, its danger, its absolute requirement that you decide what you were made of and act on that decision, had shaped him into the man he was, the man capable of recognizing Fannie Dugan when she stepped off a stagecoach and being patient enough and brave enough to go get the salt. He told her this one evening in the winter of 1891, sitting at the kitchen table after the children were in bed, the lamplight warm on the room. He told her the whole sequence of his thinking from the moment she stepped off the stage, the tightening in his chest, the decision that it was none of his business, the 4 minutes he lasted, the unnecessary salt. She listened to all of it with her full attention. "You know what I thought," she said when he finished, "when you answered my question about work, when you gave me that thorough answer." "What?" he said. "I thought, that is a man who has been paying attention to this town. And I thought, I would like to know what else he has been paying attention to." She looked at him with those hazel eyes that were entirely the same as they had been in 1879, and were also entirely deeper for everything they had looked at since. I didn't know yet what the answer was going to be, but I thought I'd like to find out. "Did you find out?" he asked. She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. "Everything I needed to," she said. He turned his hand over and held hers, and they sat in the warm kitchen light, while outside the winter wind moved through the Kansas grass, and the children slept, and the horses shifted in their stalls, and the whole real and permanent thing they had built together went on around them in every direction, solid and full and genuinely theirs. Thomas grew up to take on Wesley's training operation, not because it was expected, but because it was what he loved, and he came to it with his mother's directness and his father's patience in a combination that made him exceptionally good at the work. Clara Me left Caldwell at 20 to study at the Kansas State Normal School, the same institution that had trained David Park, and came back 4 years later with a teacher's certificate and a husband named George Whitfield, whom she had met in Emporia, and who had the good sense to recognize immediately that the Keller family was not a group whose approval you could take for granted, and that it was worth the considerable effort required to earn it. Samuel grew slowly and surely into his quiet self, read everything Fannie could put in front of him, and at 17 announced that he intended to study law, which Fannie received with such undisguised satisfaction that Wesley told her later, with love, that her face in that moment had been the proudest thing he had ever seen. Samuel studied law in Topeka, returning to Caldwell on holidays with a growing facility for the specific kind of argument that requires both precision and patience, which made him both an excellent lawyer and an occasionally challenging dinner companion, which was entirely worth it. Me Chen and Fannie had lunch together on Thursdays for 20 years, give or take the interruptions of children and illness and the general business of living. When Li Chen died in 1894, of a heart that had worked too hard for too long, Fannie sat with me through the first terrible days of it with the steadiness that had always been between them, and me held Fannie's hand at the funeral with the same steadiness. And the grief and the love in that small exchange between two women who had found each other in the dust of a Kansas frontier town was as real and as large as anything the era had produced. Eli Turner and Grace had 4 children, and the Turner family and the Keller family occupied neighboring corners of the same extended community in the way that families do when they have been genuinely glad of each other across the years. The children grew up together, and the adults grew old together, and the connection between them was one of the quiet, lasting foundations of their shared life. Wesley Keller was 50 years old in 1902, and he was, by every measure that mattered to him, a man who had been given everything he needed and had had the sense to keep it. His hair had gone gray in a way that Fannie had told him, after examining it carefully from every angle, that she found distinguished, and he had told her that she was biased, and she had said that she was entirely biased and remained correct. His hands were the hands of a man who had worked hard every day of his adult life, and were not beautiful in the way that photographs show beauty, but were beautiful in the way that use and purpose make a thing beautiful. He still worked with the horses every morning, though Thomas managed the operation now, and Wesley's role was more advisory than directing. He still sat on the western porch in the evenings and watched the sky change. He still said less than he felt, and trusted that Fannie understood the surplus, because she always did. Fannie Keller was 46 in 1902, and the fullness of her life was visible in her in a way that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with having actually lived it. She was still teaching, part-time now, and she was on the school board herself, had been for 6 years, and had been instrumental in bringing running water and better heating to the Caldwell school, and had also been the primary advocate for a proposition that the school board hire teachers regardless of race, which had been a difficult argument and had taken 3 years and had prevailed, and which she considered one of the most important things she had done. She still had lunch with Me Chen on Thursdays when she could. She still read everything she could find. She still walked the pasture trail in the evening sometimes, and sometimes Wesley walked with her, and sometimes she walked alone with the particular private pleasure of a woman who loves her life and also loves the time to stand in it and look at it from a little distance. On an evening in September of 1902, they sat together on the western porch in the autumn light, just the two of them. Thomas and his wife Alina were at their own house across the property. Clara Mee was in Caldwell with George and their 3 children. Samuel was in Topeka doing the work of the law with the patient precision he had always been made for. The horses were in for the night, and the lamplight was warm at the kitchen window behind them, and the Kansas sky was doing its extraordinary thing, turning itself amber and rose and deep violet in the west, where the sun was going down over the same horizon it had gone down over every evening for 23 years of their life together in this place. "What are you thinking?" Fannie asked. It was a question she asked with the ease of 23 years of genuine interest in the answer. "I'm thinking about salt," he said. She turned to look at him, and the look on her face was the exact compound of love and humor and warmth that he had been the beneficiary of since 1879, and it was still, after all these years, the look he was most glad to receive. "You and your salt," she said. "Best purchase I ever made," he said. She laughed, and he smiled, and the sky went on turning, and the wind moved through the grass with the low, steady sound that was the voice of the Kansas prairie, the sound that Fannie had told him, on an April evening a long time ago, that you could hear if you gave it the right word. He had spent 23 years giving it new words, her name, their children's names, the name of everything they had built together, and it had responded to every one of them. They sat on the porch until the stars came out, and the night settled over the Kansas plain with its enormous quiet, and the lamp burned steady in the kitchen window, and the house behind them held the weight of everything they had made of their one lucky, practical, genuine, and entirely real life. The stars that came out over Caldwell that night were the same stars they had always been, which is both the simplest and the most comforting thing in the world, unchanged, vast, and reliably present, like the best kind of promise. The kind that doesn't need to be spoken because it has already been kept every single night, for as long as anyone has been out there watching. And they watched them together, Fannie and Wesley Keller, on the porch of the house they had built on the land they owned in the town where they had found each other, and the life between them was whole and quiet and full, and there was nothing left undone, and it was enough. More than enough. It was everything.